Tension erupts on Jimmy Kimmel Live as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett calls out. Host's joke gone wrong. The interview that started with laughs ended with silence, as millions watched a powerful exchange about respect unfold live on national TV. The lights were bright, and the audience was excited. Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live started like any other show. The famous red and blue stage was ready for another fun night of celebrity interviews. Jimmy Kimmel walked onto the stage with his usual big smile. The audience clapped and cheered as he waved. He fixed his tie and started his opening jokes about the day's news. Everyone was laughing and having a good time. "Tonight we have someone really special," Jimmy announced. "She's known for fighting for what's right in Congress and speaking her mind. Please welcome Representative Jasmine Crockett." The audience cheered loudly as Congresswoman Crockett walked onto the stage in a bright yellow dress. She smiled and waved at everyone before sitting down across from Jimmy. She looked confident and ready to talk. "Welcome to the show, Congresswoman," Jimmy said with a friendly smile. "Thank you for having me, Jimmy." "It's great to be here," Jasmine replied, settling into her chair. They started talking about her work in Congress. Jasmine spoke about the bills she was working on and the changes she wanted to make. The audience listened carefully as she explained complex political issues in a way everyone could understand. "You know, you've gotten quite a reputation in Congress," Jimmy said, changing the subject. "I've seen some of your committee hearings online. You really don't hold back." "Well, that's my job," Jasmine said with a laugh. "I'm there to ask tough questions and fight for the people I represent." For a few minutes, everything was going great. They talked about funny moments in politics and shared some laughs. The audience was enjoying the interview. No one could have guessed what was about to happen. Jimmy leaned back in his chair and said something that would change the entire mood of the show. "You know, I have to say, you remind me of one of those hot sauce bottles with the warning labels," Jimmy joked with a casual smile. "You know, the ones that say explosive contents under pressure? I mean, when you get fired up in those hearings, I feel like we should all be wearing protective gear." The audience's laughter was mixed with some uncomfortable gasps. A few people looked at each other with wide eyes. Did he really just say that? Jasmine's smile didn't disappear, but it changed. It wasn't a happy smile anymore. She took a deep breath, straightened her back, and looked Jimmy directly in the eyes. "You know, Jimmy," she began, her voice calm but firm, "it's interesting how, when a black woman speaks with passion about issues that matter, like voting rights or health care, she's labeled as explosive or angry. But when my white male colleagues pound their fists and yell during the same hearings, they're called passionate or determined." The studio went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. "I don't come with a warning label," she continued. "I come with a law degree, years of experience, and the voices of thousands of people who trusted me to represent them. Maybe instead of focusing on how I say things, we should listen to what I'm actually saying." Jimmy's face turned red. He wasn't smiling anymore. The cameras caught him swallowing hard and shifting in his seat. The audience was frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. Jimmy stumbled over his words, clearly not prepared for her response. "Let me be clear," Jasmine continued, still composed, but with growing intensity in her voice. "I'm not here for entertainment. I'm not here to fulfill a stereotype. I'm here because I thought we could have a meaningful conversation about issues that affect real people every day." The audience began to applaud, slowly at first, then louder. Some people stood up. Jimmy looked around, realizing he had made a serious mistake. "You're absolutely right," Jimmy finally said, trying to recover. "That was a bad joke, and I apologize. You deserve better than that." Jasmine nodded but didn't smile. "I appreciate the apology, but this is exactly what I deal with every day. People focus on how I present myself rather than the content of what I'm saying. And it's exhausting." Jimmy tried to move the conversation forward. "Let's talk about your recent work on voting rights. I understand you've been leading some important initiatives there. Yes, I have, Jasmine replied. But before we move on, I think it's important to acknowledge what just happened here. This isn't just about me or about you. It's about how we talk about women in politics, especially women of color. The tension in the room was thick. The audience was completely hooked, watching this unexpected real moment unfold on what was usually a light-hearted comedy show. The thing is, Jimmy, Jasmine continued, leaning forward slightly, jokes like that aren't just jokes. They reinforce stereotypes that make it harder for people like me to be taken seriously in rooms where important decisions are made. Jimmy nodded, visibly uncomfortable but listening. Do you know what it's like to prepare twice as hard for a hearing, knowing that if you show any emotion at all, you'll be dismissed as angry or emotional? She asked. The audience was hanging on her every word. Social media was already exploding with clips of the exchange. This wasn't the usual celebrity interview with prepared funny stories. This was real. No, I don't, Jimmy admitted quietly. The show cut to a commercial break, but everyone knew this conversation was far from over. Backstage, producers were frantically discussing what to do next. The audience members were texting and posting about what they were witnessing. What would happen when they returned from the break? Would Jasmine Crockett walk off the show? Would Jimmy be able to recover? One thing was certain. This was no longer just another episode of late-night television. It had become something much more important. The commercial break seemed to last forever. Backstage, Jimmy was pacing back and forth. His producer rushed over with a worried look. "What just happened out there?" the producer whispered urgently. "I messed up," Jimmy admitted, running his hand through his hair. "That joke was completely inappropriate." In her dressing room, Jasmine sat quietly, looking at her phone, which was already flooding with messages. Her assistant stepped in. "Congresswoman, do you want to continue the interview? You don't have to go back out there." Jasmine took a deep breath. "No, I'm staying. This is exactly the conversation that needs to happen. Not just for me, but for everyone watching." When the show returned from break, the tension was still thick in the air. The audience wasn't sure what to expect. Would they pretend nothing had happened? Would there be an awkward apology and then move on to the next topic? Jimmy and Jasmine were both back in their seats. Jimmy looked directly at the camera. "Welcome back to the show. Before we continue with our interview, I want to acknowledge what happened before the break," he said seriously. "I made a joke that was insensitive and played into harmful stereotypes. I was wrong." He turned to face Jasmine. "Congresswoman Crockett, I sincerely apologize." The audience applauded, relieved that he was owning his mistake. Jasmine nodded. "I appreciate that, Jimmy. And if it was just about me, we could move on. But it's not just about me." "Tell me more," Jimmy said, leaning forward and actually listening. "Every day, women in politics, especially women of color, have to navigate these stereotypes," Jasmine explained. "We're either too angry or not assertive enough. We're too emotional or too cold. There's no winning." The audience was silent, taking in her words. "And the worst part," she continued, "is that while we're busy trying to manage how we're perceived, real issues that affect millions of Americans aren't getting the attention they deserve." Jimmy nodded slowly. "I've never had to think about that. I can just be myself on stage." "Exactly," Jasmine said. "That's privilege, Jimmy, and acknowledging it is the first step to changing things." Just when it seemed like the conversation was moving toward understanding, Jimmy made another mistake. "Well, I guess I should watch what I say around you," he joked nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "Don't want to get canceled, right?" The audience groaned. Several people covered their faces with their hands. Jimmy immediately realized his error, his eyes widening. Jasmine's expression hardened. "This isn't about canceling anyone. This is about respect and understanding. Making it about your fear of consequences misses the entire point of what we're discussing." Jimmy looked genuinely confused. But I apologized. I'm trying to learn here. An apology is just words unless it's followed by change, Jasmine replied. And making another joke about me being someone to watch what you say around reinforces the same harmful stereotype that I'm somehow unreasonable or threatening. The audience was completely captivated. This wasn't the scripted, polished interview they were used to seeing. This was raw and real. "You're right," Jimmy said, looking embarrassed. "I'm not doing a great job here, am I?" "This isn't about making you feel bad," Jasmine said, her tone softening slightly. "It's about growing. All of us, including me, are learning how to have these conversations." Jimmy seemed to realize something. "You know what? You're the guest, but you're doing all the work right now, educating me and everyone watching. That's not fair to you." "It's not," Jasmine agreed. "But unfortunately, it's what people like me deal with constantly. We don't just get to do our jobs. We have to be educators too." A woman in the audience stood up unexpectedly. "Thank you for saying that," she called out. "I feel that every day at my job too." Security looked unsure if they should intervene, but Jimmy waved them off. "What's your name?" he asked the woman. "Maria," she replied. "Maria, thank you for speaking up," Jimmy said. "I think a lot of people here might feel the same way." More audience members were nodding now. The show had transformed into something completely different from its usual format. "This is what happens when we have real conversations," Jasmine said. "People connect with each other's experiences." Jimmy seemed to be genuinely thinking, "So how do we do better? How do I do better?" "Start by listening more than you speak," Jasmine suggested, "especially to voices that haven't traditionally been heard. Question your assumptions, and when you make mistakes, because we all do, learn from them instead of getting defensive." Just as the conversation was making progress, one of the show's writers rushed onto the stage and handed Jimmy a note. He read it quickly, his expression changing. "I'm being told we need to wrap up and move to our next segment," he said, looking uncomfortable. Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "Really? Right when we're having a meaningful conversation?" The audience booed loudly. Some people started chanting, "Let her speak! Let her speak!" Jimmy looked torn between following the show's schedule and responding to the room. He glanced at his producer offstage, who was making cutting motions with his hands. "I'm sorry, but we have commercial obligations," Jimmy said weakly. Jasmine stood up. "And this right here is part of the problem. Real conversations get cut short because they make people uncomfortable or don't fit neatly into a predetermined schedule." The audience erupted in applause. Jimmy stood up too, looking flustered. "Please, Congresswoman, if you could just wait until after the commercial." "I've spent my entire career being told to wait," Jasmine said firmly. "Being told that there will be a better time to discuss important issues. But somehow that time never comes." The tension in the room was at its peak. Camera operators looked at each other, unsure of what to do. The show's director was frantically speaking into his headset. "The audience wants to hear what I have to say," Jasmine continued, gesturing to the crowd. "But once again I'm being told to wait my turn, to follow the rules that others set." Jimmy was at a loss for words. This had never happened on his show before. The carefully planned, tightly controlled environment was crumbling before his eyes. Jimmy stood frozen for a moment, then did something no one expected. He raised his hand to signal the crew. "Stop the countdown," he said firmly. The producer looked shocked. "Jimmy, we can't—" "Yes, we can," Jimmy interrupted. "This is my show, and right now this conversation is more important than our commercial break." The audience erupted in cheers and applause. Jasmine looked surprised but nodded with respect. "The commercials can wait," Jimmy continued, turning to face Jasmine. "Please, sit back down. You're right. We need to have this conversation." Jasmine slowly returned to her seat, studying Jimmy's face to determine if he was sincere. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying across the now silent studio. Jimmy took a deep breath. "No, thank you, for having the courage to call me out. When I was wrong. Twice." He turned to face the audience. "What we're witnessing tonight isn't in the script, folks. This is real. And sometimes real conversations are uncomfortable, but they're necessary." The tension in the room shifted. It was still there, but it had transformed into something different. A shared understanding that something important was happening. "Congresswoman Crockett," Jimmy said, his voice more serious than the audience had ever heard it, "I want to truly listen. Tell us what you came here to say, without jokes or interruptions from me." Jasmine looked out at the audience, then back at Jimmy. "I came here to talk about the voting rights legislation I'm working on. It affects millions of Americans who face barriers to casting their ballots." "Then let's talk about that," Jimmy said. "No time limits." For the next several minutes, Jasmine spoke passionately about voting rights, gerrymandering, and the importance of fair elections. The audience listened intently. No one checked their phones. No one whispered to their neighbors. Every eye was on her. When she finished, Jimmy didn't jump in with a joke or try to lighten the mood. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions about how viewers could get involved and what practical steps could be taken. The producer, who had been frantically pacing off stage, finally gave up and sat down. This wasn't the show they had planned, but it was the show that was happening. "You know," Jimmy said after they had discussed the legislation in depth, "I've been doing this show for years, and we've had thousands of guests, but I don't think we've ever had a conversation this real before." "That's because real conversations are messy," Jasmine replied. "They don't fit into neat segments with punchlines." "Maybe they should," Jimmy said thoughtfully. "Maybe that's what's missing from our national conversation." The audience applauded again, many people nodding in agreement. "I want to say something else," Jimmy continued. "Earlier tonight I made a joke that played into harmful stereotypes, and when you called me out, my first instinct was to get defensive and then to try to move on quickly. That was wrong." Jasmine listened quietly. "I've been thinking about what you said, about how women in politics, especially women of color, are constantly navigating these unfair perceptions, and I realize that I've been part of the problem." A hush fell over the studio. No one had expected this level of honesty. "I can't promise I'll never make a mistake again," Jimmy continued, "but I can promise to do better, to listen when I may, called out, to use this platform more responsibly." "That's all any of us can do," Jasmine said. "Learn and grow." The director signaled that they absolutely had to go to commercial this time. Jimmy nodded in acknowledgement. "We need to take a break," he said to the audience, "but when we come back, Congresswoman Crockett has agreed to take some questions from the audience about her voting rights initiative." More applause filled the studio. As they went to commercial, Jimmy and Jasmine continued talking, their body language now relaxed and engaged rather than tense and defensive. When the cameras stopped rolling, the studio audience didn't scatter or check their phones as they normally would during a break. Instead, they were talking to each other, having their own discussions about what they'd just witnessed. "That was amazing," one audience member said to another. "I've never seen anything like that on TV before." "Me neither," replied another. "I feel like I actually learned something tonight." Backstage, the show's executive producer approached Jimmy, looking concerned. "That was a big risk," the producer said. "Going off script like that could have been a disaster." "Maybe we need to take more risks," Jimmy replied. "Maybe that's what people are hungry for. Real conversations instead of just sound bites and prepared anecdotes." After the commercial break, the show returned with something that had never happened before on Jimmy Kimmel Live, an impromptu town hall. Audience members asked Jasmine questions about everything from voting rights to her personal journey in politics. Jimmy stepped back, letting Jasmine take center stage. He listened more than he spoke, occasionally adding a thoughtful comment or question, but never trying to make himself the focus. By the end of the segment, the mood in the studio had completely transformed. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation had become a moment of connection and understanding. As the show came to a close, Jimmy and Jasmine stood side by side. "I want to thank Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett for not just being on our show tonight, but for turning it into something much more meaningful," Jimmy said sincerely. "And I want to thank you, Jimmy," Jasmine replied, "for showing that it's possible to turn a mistake into an opportunity for growth. That's something we can all learn from." They shook hands, not the quick formal handshake of strangers, but the genuine handshake of two people who had come through a difficult conversation with new respect for each other. As the credits rolled, the audience gave them a standing ovation, not for the jokes or the entertainment, but for the courage to have a real conversation on national television. By morning, clips of the show had gone viral. News outlets were covering the exchange. Social media was filled with discussions about stereotype, respect, and representation. Some praised Jimmy for his willingness to listen and learn. Others celebrated Jasmine for her strength and eloquence. But beyond the headlines and tweets, something more important had happened. Millions of viewers had witnessed a moment of genuine growth and understanding, a reminder that even in our divided times, real conversation can bridge differences and change minds. And in living rooms across America, people were having their own conversations, inspired by what they'd seen, about stereotypes, about listening, about what it means to truly hear each other. One show wouldn't change everything, but it was a start, a reminder that even in the most unlikely places, like a late-night comedy show, meaningful change can begin with the courage to speak truth and the humility to listen.